What does it mean to build a museum about absence, where the architecture itself becomes a monument to memory, and where every wall, every void, every sharp angle forces you to confront one of history's darkest chapters? Today we're exploring the Jewish Museum Berlin, a building that doesn't just house history. It embodies it, twists it, fractures it, and ultimately transforms it into one of the most powerful architectural statements of the 21st century. Designed by Polish-American architect Daniel Libeskind and completed in 2001, this isn't your typical museum where neutral white galleries politely frame artifacts behind glass. No, this is a building that grabs you by the shoulders, disorients you, unsettles you, and refuses to let you forget. So let's dive into how Libeskind took the weight of Jewish history in Berlin, the city that was once the vibrant heart of European Jewish culture, before becoming the administrative center of the Holocaust, and translated that impossible burden into zinc, concrete, and empty space. The story begins, as many great architectural stories do, with a competition. In 1988, the Berlin Senate announced an international competition for an extension to the existing Berlin Museum, with a section dedicated to Jewish history. This was no small undertaking. Berlin's Jewish community had been decimated during the Nazi era, and the very idea of creating a Jewish museum in the city where the final solution was orchestrated carried enormous symbolic weight. Out of 165 entries from around the world, the jury selected a design from Daniel Libeskind, a relative unknown in the world of built architecture at the time, having spent most of his career as an academic and theorist. His winning proposal, originally titled Between the Lines, was not just a building but a philosophical statement about absence, trauma, and the impossibility of representing the unrepresentable. The project would take over a decade to complete, fraught with political debates, funding challenges, and construction complexities, but when it finally opened in 2001, it immediately became one of the most visited museums in Germany, drawing millions of visitors who come not just to see the exhibits but to experience the architecture itself. To understand what makes this building so extraordinary, you need to understand the context it emerged from. Berlin in the late 20th century was a city grappling with its identity, recently reunified after decades of Cold War division, and forced to confront its role in the Holocaust. The existing Berlin Museum, housed in an 18th century Baroque building, represented the old Berlin, elegant and orderly, but it couldn't contain the fractured narrative of Jewish life in Germany, a story of rich cultural contribution, violent rupture, near total destruction, and tentative rebirth. Libeskind understood that the architecture couldn't simply provide neutral containers for artifacts. Instead, the building itself had to become the primary exhibit, a physical manifestation of the Jewish experience in Germany with all its complexity, trauma, and absence. The design concept is rooted in several intersecting ideas, what Libeskind called reading between the lines of German and Jewish history. He began with two lines, one straight but broken into many fragments, representing the continuity and discontinuity of German history, and another zigzagging and tortuous, representing the irretrievable void left by the destruction of Jewish culture. Where these lines intersect, they create spaces of encounter, while the voids that run through the building remain empty, inaccessible, representing absence itself. From above, the building resembles a deconstructed Star of David or a lightning bolt, a jagged zinc-clad form that slashes through the orderly Berlin streetscape like a wound. This isn't accidental geometry for visual effect. Every angle, every deviation from orthogonal form carries symbolic weight. The building's plan is generated by connecting the addresses of prominent Jewish and German figures, creating an invisible matrix of cultural connection that becomes architectural form. Walter Benjamin, Heinrich von Kleist, Paul Celan, and others are mapped onto the Berlin street grid, and lines connecting their homes and deaths create the museum's angular geometry. This methodology is pure Libeskind, where architecture becomes a kind of three-dimensional text, meant to be read, interpreted, and felt rather than simply occupied. The materiality of the building is equally loaded with meaning. The exterior is clad in zinc panels with narrow, seemingly random window slashes that cut through the facade. These aren't windows in any conventional sense. They don't provide views or mark floors or rooms. Instead, they follow the lines connecting those addresses of Berlin's cultural figures, appearing as scars or wounds on the building's skin. The zinc was chosen to weather and develop a patina over time, a living material that changes and ages, much like memory itself. Up close, you notice the facade isn't smooth but composed of overlapping panels that create subtle shadows and texture, giving the massive form a kind of tactile vulnerability. The building seems both fortress-like and fragile, impenetrable yet scarred. Inside, the spatial strategy is deliberately disorienting. You enter through the old Baroque museum building, descending underground into what Libeskind calls the axis, a subterranean level where three corridors intersect but never quite align. This underground realm is dark, angular, and claustrophobic. You're literally below the city, below history, in a space that feels like a conceptual basement of memory. The three axes represent different trajectories. The axis of continuity leads upstairs to the main exhibition spaces, representing life continuing despite trauma. The axis of exile leads outside to the Garden of Exile, a disorienting outdoor installation of 49 tilted concrete columns filled with earth and topped with olive willows. And the axis of the Holocaust leads to the Holocaust Tower, a raw concrete void, unheated, barely lit, rising several stories to a narrow opening at the top. These axes aren't just circulation routes. They're experiential metaphors, forcing visitors to make choices, to follow paths that embody historical trajectories. The circulation through the main exhibition spaces is equally unconventional. You ascend a dramatically narrow concrete staircase, its walls converging as you climb, creating a sense of compression and effort. Once in the galleries, you discover that the building doesn't provide the neutral, flexible exhibition space museums typically desire. Instead, every room is angular, walls meet at unexpected angles, floors sometimes slope, windows slash through at odd heights, and the famous voids, 6 vertical empty spaces that run the full height of the building, interrupt the galleries at irregular intervals. These voids are the conceptual heart of the project. They're not accessible to visitors, remaining perpetually empty, representing the absence left by the Jews murdered in the Holocaust. You can glimpse them through small openings, peer into their darkness, sense their presence as you move through the galleries, but you can never enter them. They create a powerful spatial metaphor. The void isn't somewhere else, in the past or in another place. It's here, right in the middle of everything, shaping the space around it. One void is actually accessible, the memory void on the ground floor, where Israeli artist Minashi Kadishman's installation Shalchet, Fallen Leaves, covers the floor with over 10,000 circular iron faces, their mouths open in silent screams. Visitors are invited to walk across them, and the metallic clanging creates a haunting soundscape that echoes through the void. This might be the most visceral moment in the building, where architecture, art, and memory collide in a deeply physical, almost unbearable way. Structurally, the building is a concrete frame with a zinc facade hung as a rain screen, but the construction required extraordinary precision. Those angular walls, tilted surfaces, and irregular geometries meant that almost nothing in the building is standard. Every piece had to be custom fabricated, every angle calculated, every junction detailed to maintain the geometric purity of Libeskind's concept. The structural engineers had to work with a form that resists conventional structural logic. Zigzagging walls don't want to stand up straight, sloping floors challenge drainage and accessibility, and those narrow window cuts compromise the facade's structural integrity. Yet the building stands solid and monumental, testament to the possibility of realizing even the most conceptually driven, geometrically complex architecture. Lighting in the museum is carefully controlled to create specific atmospheric effects. Natural light enters only through those slashed windows, creating dramatic shafts of light that move across the angular walls throughout the day, never illuminating the space evenly but creating zones of brightness and shadow. In the voids, light is minimal, entering only from above, creating dim vertical shafts that emphasize the emptiness. The Holocaust Tower is perhaps the most extreme lighting condition, almost entirely dark except for a thin sliver of light from a narrow cut high above, creating a space of profound darkness that takes minutes for your eyes to adjust to. This isn't lighting as functionality, it's lighting as existential metaphor, where darkness and light, presence and absence, become palpable experiences. The experiential qualities of the Jewish Museum Berlin are what separate it from conventional architecture. This is a building designed to make you feel something, to physically embody concepts that are otherwise abstract or unimaginable. The disorientation you feel in those angular spaces isn't poor design. It's intentional, meant to evoke the disorientation of exile, of displacement, of having your world turned upside down. The compression you feel in the narrow staircases, the unease you experience in the tilted garden of exile, the cold you feel in the Holocaust Tower. These aren't accidents but carefully orchestrated experiences. Libeskind was designing what he called architecture as feeling, where spatial qualities create emotional and psychological responses that no amount of historical text or artifact display could achieve alone. Critics and users have responded to the building with intense reactions, both positive and negative. Some praised it as a masterpiece, a building that finally found an architectural language adequate to representing the Holocaust without trivializing it or turning it into entertainment. Others criticized it as overly prescriptive, arguing that the architecture is so dominant it overwhelms the actual historical content, turning the museum into a monument to the architect's ego rather than to Jewish history. Curators initially struggled with how to install exhibitions in these difficult spaces. Those angular walls don't accept standard display systems, the voids interrupt narrative flow, and the overall experience is so intense that visitors often feel emotionally exhausted before they've seen half the collection. In fact, when the building first opened for a brief preview period before any exhibitions were installed, thousands of people came just to experience the empty architecture, suggesting that the building itself had become the primary exhibit. Over time, the museum has developed exhibition strategies that work with rather than against the architecture, using the spaces to create dialogical relationships between objects, stories, and spatial experience. The influence of the Jewish Museum Berlin on contemporary architecture cannot be overstated. Before this building, Libeskind was largely unknown as a practitioner, but its success launched him into the highest ranks of international architects, leading to commissions around the world, including the master plan for the World Trade Center site in New York. More broadly, the building demonstrated that conceptual, theoretically driven architecture could be built, could function as a public building, and could connect with a mass audience emotionally and intellectually. It helped legitimize a more expressive, symbolic approach to architecture at a moment when late modernism and early parametricism were dominating the discourse. The building showed that architecture could carry meaning without being literal, could represent trauma without being maudlin, and could serve memory without becoming a kitsch monument. It influenced a generation of memorial projects, from Peter Eisenman's memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe in Berlin to countless museums and memorials around the world that seek to use spatial experience, rather than just historical narrative, to convey difficult histories. The building also raised important questions about the ethics of aestheticizing trauma, about whether architecture can or should attempt to represent the unrepresentable, and about the role of effect and experience in public architecture. These debates continue, but the Jewish Museum Berlin remains the reference point, the project everyone mentions when discussing how architecture can engage with historical trauma. 23 years after its completion, the building remains as powerful and unsettling as ever, its zinc skin now weathered to a darker patina. Its space is still capable of stopping visitors in their tracks and forcing them to confront uncomfortable truths about history, memory, and absence. In the end, what Daniel Libeskind achieved with the Jewish Museum Berlin is rare in architecture. A building that is simultaneously deeply conceptual and viscerally experiential, a work of architecture that respects the gravity of its subject matter while pushing the boundaries of what buildings can mean and how they can make us feel. It's a reminder that architecture, at its best, isn't just about solving functional problems or creating beautiful forms. It's about creating meaningful experiences that connect us to larger ideas, histories, and human realities. Whether you love or hate Libeskind's approach, whether you find the building too overwhelming or profoundly moving, you can't deny that it changed something fundamental about how we think architecture can engage with memory, trauma, and the weight of history. So if you found this deep dive into one of the most significant buildings of our time valuable, hit that subscribe button and join the UrbArchitect community, where we explore architecture that matters, that challenges us, and that reminds us why buildings are never just buildings but always statements about who we are and what we value.